Imagine losing more than a decade of your life, locked inside a prison cell for crimes you didn't commit. This is the story of Albert Johnson, a father, a fiancé, a man who had a future, until one night in 1992, a simple speeding stop turned into a nightmare. He was accused of 2 brutal assaults. Both victims identified him. The jury believed them, and Albert was sentenced to nearly 40 years in prison. But here's the truth. There was no real evidence. No DNA. No fingerprints. Nothing but shaky eyewitnesses and pressure from detectives who wanted a quick arrest. Albert would spend 11 long years fighting for his freedom, teaching himself the law, begging for DNA testing, and holding on to hope even when the system tried to crush him. And when the truth finally came out, it shocked everyone. This is not just a story about Albert Johnson. It's a story about how fragile justice can be, how easily the system can destroy an innocent man, and how one person's refusal to break can change everything. Stay with us, because by the end of this documentary, you'll see how one man's fight for freedom exposed flaws that could affect us all. February 1992. A quiet night in a small town. Albert Johnson, a young father, engaged to be married, is driving home. He doesn't know it yet, but in just a few minutes, his life will change forever. A flash of police lights fills his rearview mirror. He pulls over. What should have been a routine speeding stop becomes the beginning of an 11-year nightmare. At that moment, Albert had no reason to worry. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't hiding anything. He was simply a man with a family waiting for him at home. Albert was engaged to the woman he loved. He had children who adored him. He was building a future. He was like millions of fathers across America, ordinary, hardworking, hopeful. But that night, none of it would matter, because the system wasn't looking for the truth. It was looking for someone to blame. Within hours, Albert Johnson would be accused of a violent crime. Not 1, but 2. Crimes he had nothing to do with. And the punishment? 39 years in prison. Nearly 4 decades of his life stolen, because of bad police work, destroyed evidence, and one of the most unreliable tools in the justice system, eyewitness memory. This is not just a story about Albert Johnson. It's a story about how fragile justice really is, and how quickly an innocent man can lose everything. Albert's nightmare began with a single phone call. A young woman reported being attacked. She described her attacker as a black man in a small white car. That description alone set off a chain of events that would trap Albert Johnson in a web of lies and mistakes. And it all started on that February night, when the flashing lights filled his mirror. Before his arrest, Albert Johnson lived a life like anyone else. He wasn't rich, he wasn't powerful. He was an ordinary man trying to make ends meet. He worked hard, he came home tired, but he always made time for his kids. Albert was engaged to the woman he loved. They dreamed of their wedding, of raising their children together, of building a better future. He was a young man with responsibilities, but also with hope. That's what makes this story so painful. Because Albert had everything to lose. He wasn't perfect. No one is. But to his children, he was a hero. To his fiancée, he was a partner. To his friends, he was just Albert, someone who wanted the same simple things we all do: love, security, and respect. On that February night in 1992, Albert thought he was heading home to his family. Instead, he was heading into a nightmare. Because at the same time Albert was driving, miles away, another story was unfolding. A woman, terrified, called police to report a rape. Her description was vague, but it would be enough to change Albert's life forever. The justice system had found its suspect, and Albert Johnson had no idea he was about to be trapped. On that February evening, a young woman stood at a payphone, talking to a friend. It was late, and the streets were quiet. A car pulled up. Inside, a black man asked her for directions. She stepped closer, trying to be polite. Then she noticed something shiny inside the car, a piece of metal. Her heart froze. She thought it was a gun. The driver insisted she get in. Terrified, she obeyed. And in that moment, her nightmare began. The man drove her to a secluded intersection. The streets were empty, the night silent. There, she was forced into unthinkable acts. First, he made her perform oral sex. Then he raped her. Alone, powerless, and scared for her life, she could only pray it would end quickly. When it was over, he drove off, leaving her shaken, broken, and desperate for help. Minutes later, police received her call. She described her attacker as a black man in a small white car. It was vague. It could have been anyone. But that description would soon become the trap that caught Albert Johnson. Because, by coincidence, Albert was driving a small white car that very night. An hour later, Albert was pulled over for speeding. Nothing unusual, until the officer heard the radio report. A black man, a white car, and Albert Johnson fit that description. Inside his vehicle, the officer noticed a chrome bar. Shiny, metallic, just like the victim had described. At that moment, Albert Johnson went from a driver on his way home to the prime suspect in a violent crime. After Albert was pulled over for speeding, police had a choice. They could investigate carefully, or they could take a shortcut. Instead of preparing a lineup, they decided to use what's called a show-up. A show-up is when a single suspect is shown directly to a victim, often right after the crime. It is one of the most unreliable forms of identification in law enforcement. But that night, it would seal Albert's fate. The police drove the victim to the spot where Albert had been pulled over. She was told, "The man you are about to see may or may not be the attacker." But think about it. She had just survived a terrifying ordeal. She was traumatized, and now she was looking at a single man, in police custody, standing by a white car. To her, the message was clear. This must be him. She glanced at Albert, at his car, and at the shiny chrome bar inside. The details fit, at least on the surface. Within seconds, she said she was sure. She pointed at Albert Johnson and confirmed. That's him. It was fast. Too fast. And yet, her word was enough to turn suspicion into certainty. From that moment on, Albert Johnson wasn't just a suspect. He was the suspect. No other leads were pursued. No other evidence was considered. The system had its man, even if it was the wrong one. And for Albert, there would be no turning back. Just days later, another report of rape shook a nearby city. This time, the victim was jogging at a high school track. A man approached her with what she believed was a gun. He forced her behind a building. There, she was assaulted, first oral sex, then rape. He stole her watch. He stole her gold chain. And then, as if mocking her, he walked her back to the track before telling her to leave. Like the first victim, she was terrified. But unlike the first case, there were no suspects. Police now had two crimes, two different victims. But when Albert Johnson was arrested for the first case, detectives decided he must be guilty of the second. There was no evidence connecting him. No stolen jewelry recovered. Nothing. Still, one detective, who had known Albert since childhood, was convinced. And he was determined to prove it. The detective assembled a photo lineup. Albert's face was included. When the victim looked through the photos, she hesitated. She said Albert's skin was lighter than the attacker's. She wasn't sure. But instead of listening, the detective pressured her. He said Albert had been in prison working out, with little exposure to the sun. That's why his skin looked lighter. And then he pushed harder. The perpetrator is in this lineup. You just have to pick him. The woman still had doubts. But under pressure, she made a choice. She pointed to Albert Johnson. Immediately, the detective confirmed it. Yes, that's him. Her uncertainty was erased, not because she was sure, but because she was told to be sure. And just like that, Albert was now accused of not one, but two rapes. Two accusations. Two victims. Two identifications. Albert's fate was sealed. The truth didn't matter anymore. From the perspective of police and prosecutors, they had their man. What they didn't have was real evidence. Albert Johnson was now charged with two violent crimes. The prosecutions were built almost entirely on eyewitness identifications. There was no DNA evidence presented, no physical proof, no fingerprints. But in courtrooms, juries often trust the human voice more than science. And prosecutors knew that. In the first case, the victim took the stand. She pointed to Albert and said, "That's the man who raped me." Her voice carried weight. The jury listened. Albert's lawyer asked for DNA testing, but the court never allowed it. The rape kit, the one piece of evidence that could prove his innocence, would not be tested. Without it, the jury had only her word, and her word was enough. In the second case, the jogging victim also testified. She admitted she had doubts. She admitted Albert's skin seemed lighter than her attacker's. But the detective's explanation was repeated. The photo lineup was presented as solid proof. Once again, Albert Johnson was identified. Once again, the jury listened. In both trials, the verdict was the same. Guilty. Albert Johnson was sentenced to 39 years in prison. 39 years based on nothing more than mistaken memory, destroyed evidence, and a system that favored speed over truth. Albert Johnson was only in his 20s when the cell doors closed behind him. 39 years. That was the number handed down by the court. As the metal bars slammed shut, Albert realized he was no longer a fiancé, no longer a father, at least not in the same way. To the world, he was now an inmate. Life in prison was harsh. Each day began and ended with the sound of clanging metal doors. Meals were cold and rushed. Privacy didn't exist. Violence was always close. But perhaps the worst part wasn't the food or the noise or even the danger. It was the waiting. Waiting for time to pass. Waiting for someone to believe him. Outside, Albert's family struggled without him. His fiancée was left to raise the children alone. Letters became their only lifeline. He wrote about his love for them, about his hope for freedom. But as the years dragged on, the future they dreamed of together began to fade. Albert was missing birthdays, first days of school, holidays, moments he could never get back. Yet even in prison, Albert refused to give up. He turned to books. He studied law. He spent long nights in the prison library, learning the system that had stolen his freedom. If the courts wouldn't fight for him, Albert would learn to fight for himself. Years passed behind prison walls. Albert could have given up. Many men in his position did. But Albert wasn't built to accept injustice. Every night, after the noise of the prison died down, he opened law books. Thick volumes. Cases, precedents, appeals. He read them cover to cover, searching for a way out. Slowly, Albert began to understand the legal system that had failed him. He studied how wrongful convictions happen. He learned about unreliable eyewitness memory, about how suggestive police tactics can create false identifications. And above all, he learned about DNA, the science that could prove innocence if only the courts would allow it. Albert began filing motions on his own. Handwritten petitions, carefully drafted arguments, requests for DNA testing. But most were denied. Judges dismissed him as just another prisoner claiming he was innocent. What they didn't see was the truth. Albert wasn't just claiming. He was right. Still, Albert never gave up. He knew that DNA could prove what words could not. He pressed every lawyer he could find. He begged the courts to protect the evidence. But in one case, it was already too late. The rape kit had been destroyed, erased before it could clear his name. For Albert, hope would now rest on the second case. One kit. One chance. Albert's studies led him to a simple truth. The rape kit from the first case could prove his innocence. He begged his attorney to request DNA testing. He pleaded with the courts to preserve the evidence. But his lawyer never filed the motion. The request never came. And while Albert waited, the evidence was destroyed. When Albert learned the truth, it hit him like a punch to the chest. The one piece of evidence that could clear his name, gone. Not lost. Not misplaced. Destroyed. A mistake that could never be undone. It wasn't an accident. It was negligence. The system had failed Albert once again. First by accusing him. Then by convicting him. Now by erasing the very proof that could set him free. For Albert, it felt like the walls of his cell had closed in tighter. His fight for freedom had been dealt a crushing blow. But Albert didn't give up. Because while the first case's evidence was gone, there was still the second. One rape kit had been preserved. One chance at DNA testing remained. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Albert fighting. Albert kept writing motion after motion, letter after letter. He asked judges. He asked lawyers. He asked anyone who would listen. Test the DNA. It will prove my innocence. But every request came back the same. Stamped, denied. Over and over again. Years turned into decades. Albert watched younger inmates arrive, serve short sentences, and leave. He watched seasons change through the bars of his window. He watched his children grow up through visiting room glass. And still, the courts refused to test the evidence. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, science was advancing. DNA testing was revolutionizing the justice system. Across the country, men were being freed after decades in prison, proven innocent by science. Albert knew he could be one of them. If only the courts would let the truth come out. Through all the denials, Albert held on to hope. He told himself, one day they'll have to test it. One day the truth will come out. It was the only thing that kept him going. A thread of hope, tied to a single box of evidence that could save his life. After more than a decade of waiting, Albert's persistence finally paid off. The rape kit from the second case had survived. It was still sealed, still untouched, still waiting to speak the truth. At last, a court approved DNA testing. For the first time, Albert's fate rested not on memory, not on guesses, but on science. In a quiet laboratory, technicians swabbed, sampled, and tested. Machines whirred, lights blinked, data appeared on screens. It was science versus suspicion, fact versus falsehood. For Albert, it was the moment of truth. The results came back in October 2002. The DNA proved one thing with absolute certainty. Albert Johnson could not have been the attacker. 11 years after his conviction, science had finally spoken. Albert was innocent. The courtroom that once called him guilty now had to face the truth. The prosecutors, the detectives, even the victims, all had been wrong. Albert Johnson had lost more than a decade of his life to a system built on mistakes. But now the cracks in that system were breaking wide open. On a crisp morning in late 2002, the prison gates clanged open. Albert Johnson stepped outside, not as an inmate, but as a free man. For the first time in 11 years, he felt fresh air on his face without chains on his wrists. Waiting for him were the people who never gave up, his family, his children, his loved ones. The hugs were long. The tears were real. Albert's kids were no longer small. They had grown up without him. And now, at last, they could hold their father again. The simple things felt extraordinary. The taste of fast food, the feel of civilian clothes, the sound of traffic instead of metal doors. Every moment was both joyful and painful, a reminder of all the years he had lost. Freedom was sweet, but it was also complicated. Albert had missed birthdays, graduations, first steps. He had lost nearly 4,000 days to a cell. He was free, but he could never get back the years stolen from him. Albert could have walked away quietly, but after 11 years stolen, he refused to let the system bury his story. He wasn't just a survivor of wrongful conviction, he was now a fighter for justice. He spoke out against the failures that destroyed his life. The detective who pressured witnesses. The prosecutors who ignored doubts. The lawyer who failed to save the rape kit. Albert named them, one by one, and demanded accountability. Albert's case became a symbol of the dangers of eyewitness misidentification. Across America, juries trusted victims' memories, but studies showed how unreliable they could be. Albert's wrongful conviction was living proof that even a confident identification could be dead wrong. Albert joined the fight to change the system. He called for better lineup procedures, for preserving evidence, for funding DNA testing before lives were destroyed. He knew his story wasn't unique, and he refused to stop until others like him found justice. Albert Johnson's exoneration wasn't just about one man. It was about hundreds of others across the country, men and women wrongfully convicted, serving time for crimes they didn't commit. Albert's case was part of a much bigger story, the story of a justice system in desperate need of reform. DNA testing became the great equalizer. It proved what witnesses, prosecutors, and even juries could not. It revealed the truth hiding in plain sight. Albert's freedom showed how science could correct human failure, if the evidence was preserved. But Albert's first case reminded the world of another truth. When evidence is destroyed, when defense lawyers fail, when detectives cut corners, lives are ruined. Justice doesn't just depend on science. It depends on responsibility. Albert's story became a warning that justice must be protected at every step. That lives hang on every decision, from the way a lineup is done to whether a rape kit is saved. And that if we ignore these lessons, more innocent people will suffer the same fate. Albert Johnson lost 11 years of his life. He lost birthdays, graduations, and precious time with his children. But through it all, he refused to break. He fought for the truth, and in the end, the truth set him free. No court ruling, no financial settlement, no apology can give Albert back the years he lost. The scars of injustice remain. But his story forces us to ask a haunting question. How many more Alberts are still behind bars? Albert's journey reminds us that freedom is fragile, and justice must be guarded carefully. It shows us the power of science, the danger of negligence, and the need for compassion. Most of all, it reminds us that one voice, even from behind bars, can change the world. Albert Johnson's story is more than a tragedy. It is a lesson, a warning, and a call to action, to make sure no innocent person spends another day in prison for a crime they did not commit.